if all of the Apple iPhones were made in the United States, according to some article that flashed across my screen, they would cost like 3 times as much as they do now. That most people won't be able to afford smartphones in the future, according to this article. Okay, maybe that's true, maybe it isn't. But Chris said, well, that's okay. The chips that they're going to implant in our brain will be really cheap to make.
Yeah.
What people have instead of, we'll transition from smartphones into neural links, and it'll be the best picture quality you've ever seen, better than your own eyes could produce, and it will be the fastest connections you've ever had.
Maybe, Doug, Elon Musk will lead us to Mars, and it'll generate loads of engineering and other STEM jobs, like unforeseen by people in my generation. And we'll have this massive employment boom. And while Americans go to Mars, you'll still have, like, I don't know, sweatshops in Vietnam.
But only with the added benefit of, if you write, down with Elon Musk on your virtual keyboard in your head, someone might be there somewhere in the chain to press a button and you're going to have a stroke.
What? No, Doug.
The Neuralink.
You think that the Neuralink is going to be used to remove the enemies of the...
I don't believe it's necessarily
Now
the
we're
case,
back in the world of Naomi Klein. Now we're back in, capitalism.
Well, what's
the dictator?
The technology will be there. It will actually be there. It will be right inside our head. So now they're doing... Look, bear with me. Right now they're doing psyops, and they're trying to orchestrate control through censorship, and maybe they won't give us a stroke. Maybe they'll just say, "Oh no, you shouldn't have that thought," and press that button. You won't have that thought anymore. I mean, there is that side to where this is going.
That's dystopic. That assumes that people have emancipatory ideas to begin with that need to be shut down.
Yes, it is both dystopic and utopian at the same time.
Yeah.
The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Pam Nogales is a historian of political thought, transatlantic intellectual history, and American society in the long 19th century. She also studied visual and critical studies at the School of Art Institute in Chicago, and is one of the founding members of the Platypus Affiliated Society. Pam, welcome to the Diet Soap podcast.
Thanks, Doug. Nice to be here.
You reached out to me asking to follow up after the, on Monday we did the Sublation magazine show, and we debriefed, Benjamin Studebaker and I debriefed after our participation in the Platypus Affiliated Society convention over the weekend. And you followed up and asked if you might come on to debrief me after the debrief. This will be, you'll be coming ahead of tomorrow's Catrone Zone, where I get debriefed on the debrief from Catrone. So this will be, I'm being, trained up, disciplined well. And I'm looking forward to this conversation, particularly about your contribution to the panel you did with Studebaker entitled What Was Neoliberalism? But I want to give you a chance to just start by telling me what your impressions were of Studebaker's contribution to the debrief, or in my response with that conversation on Monday.
Well, it's funny, right? I wanted to come on here to help you work through the panel in the way that a platypus member would talk to another platypus member, which doesn't sound like this. This particular idea is wrong, and this particular idea is right. And this person had a better theory of neoliberalism, and this is stupid, or this doesn't work, and this is mushy, and this is cultural, and this doesn't get at the real thing. So that's not the way that Platypus talks about it. And so I thought, is it a debrief what you guys did? It sounds like it was more like, I appreciated how Ben was speaking to you on the episode, because it seemed to be actually more politically honest than some of the things that he said on the panel itself, where he seemed to want to like push against like platypus by talking to an earlier version of himself, trying to get rid of his earlier liberalism, and in a sense kind of dodge certain propositions that the panel description had presented. Although some of the Q&A, especially I think the question by Ed Remus towards the end in terms of periodization and why might we consider thinking about neoliberalism as a distinct moment rather than not capitalism, but as a distinct moment in the history of capitalism, I got him to think a bit differently about it. But yeah, my response was, I think it's difficult for Benjamin Studebaker to take seriously or to consider it worthwhile, I should say, that platypus takes up the left as an object of education. That, you know, we had a chance to speak at the bar, and I think he's, you know, and of course, I respect his opinion, but I think the ultimate difference here is that he doesn't think that it's worthwhile. Like, why are you guys thinking about David Harvey, Naomi Klein? These people were just wrong. You can just move on from these people, right? You can just have better ideas. As he told us, you know, that maybe we could have just better ideas. And in that way, the better ideas can win out and advise a future audience that he cannot yet find. And I just thought, Doug wants to learn from the panel. Okay, like let's do some like platypus work. Like, what does it look like when I sit down with a member, with a young member, right? And they're like, oh man, like I don't know what just happened in there. Like, what was this said? What was this about? I wanted to do the work with you to see if we could get somewhere else so that the conversation could be clarifying and illuminating in its totality as a constellation where each one has a role to play, but it's about the object of knowledge being generated as a result of the discussion rather than like picking your fighter on the panel, like who's got the best idea.
Okay, yeah. That's very interesting. I would like to do that with you very much, but here's the difficulty. I listened to your presentation and I listened to Benjamin Studebaker's presentation, so you're going to have to fill me in.
Oh no, Doug. All right. F. Like that's right. Okay, so I will just use this opportunity to say that like the practice that we're putting forth, the hosting of the conversation, is about getting something from the conversation as a whole and being able to register points of agreement across the panelists, points of disagreement, also absences. Like sometimes one person will raise a problem or question and it won't get answered. And that's also something to learn from, right? So for example, there was a question about the early 20th century radical Second International and their conception of the state that Jamie Merchant doesn't take up at all, even though it was directed at him. And that's like an interesting absence, right? Like why choose not to respond to this question? But okay, I can do the work.
I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I did go to panels while I was there, but I arrived at this convention an hour after this panel had started, I think. And so then today you sent me a link to kind of say, hey, listen to this. And so I did, but I only had a certain amount of time between other things. So I just listened to yours and his. My mistake. I apologize.
That's okay. It's a teaching opportunity for the listeners out there.
All right.
We're not asking you to choose your fighter. That's like not what's happening. It's
I definitely think I fall into that trap, like I want to find the person that I agree with the most. And even though I have listened to enough platypus panels to recognize that generally speaking, you cannot choose a fighter on. But when I went up on for my panel, I wanted to be the fighter everyone chose, right? that was my aim when I went after Bill Ayers on my panel.
We can talk about your panel. Maybe that will be the patron.
Yeah, that would be a good idea. Okay. Okay. So let's talk about this panel. So let me just say what I got out of your presentation, which was that a lot of what you said was very familiar to me, not only because I'm somewhat familiar with the Platypus Affiliated Society, but also because I'm familiar with a bit of the history that you covered, right? It's the millennial left. I was awake and involved in that period of time. Like I was not just an adult, but I was participating on the left. And so, I found myself rethinking. You mentioned how at the beginning of the millennial left, or around the time of the economic crisis, the book, you didn't actually name the book, but The Coming Insurrection was influential on the left, and that that Occupy could have been thought of as an insurrection, which itself was a form of resistance politics rather than revolutionary politics. And in fact, I recall that anarchists I knew at that time were mouthing along, it's not revolution but resistance that we're aiming to create. So you started there. You noted how the other side of that was the Marxist, the Marxist approach, which wanted to return, the sectarian Marxist approach wanted to turn to a class politics, but it was, that assumed that the working class was already constituted as a subject politically, and that what was needed was to support that political class, already political class. And Occupy ended up being split between these two factions, but resolved into the Democratic Party, ultimately because on the one hand, what I took from it was, on the one hand, the class first type Marxists were presuming that the working class hadn't suffered the defeats of the 20th century. They were already fully organized as a political class. And when they tried to become political, they were led into the labor movement as it was, which was a faction of the Democratic Party. And the insurrectionists, resistance, likewise had nowhere to go but towards influencing the Democrats as well.
That's not quite what I said. There was this moment in our panel. We had a series. Platypus had an international series of panels, radical interpretation of the present crisis, and we invited people like David Graeber, Saul Newman, Hillel Tickton, David Harvey, Paul Matic Jr. The list goes on. Andrew Kleiman was in the New York panel. And it's that conversation which I'm trying to work through in the presentation to say, how did the left experience the crisis of this neoliberalism as it was emerging in that post 2007, 2008 downturn? Because I would say Occupy was definitely much more directed in the spirit of the kind of neo-anarchist moment. The sectarian left was not really involved and present, although they were around. And what I found was that there were conversations in those rooms in London and New York and Chicago where we held these panels that pointed towards the necessity for a new kind of politics. So not resolvable through insurrectionary activity, right? Not resolvable through the coming insurrection, rhizomatic new forms of association, intersubjects, etc. Or that's not resolvable that's not resolvable by simply repeating that the class exists, the working class exists, and you had to support it. The conversations in those rooms seemed to point to the fact that we needed to constitute a new kind of political left to really take up the problems of the capitalism in crisis in 2007, 2008. And so what happened to that insight? So I guess that's where I'm pushing back on the conclusion, because what happened to the insight is that there was an attempt to take that up. There was a neo-Kautskian turn among the millennial left that took up the Second International history, that took up this the task and issue of mass politics, and specifically the party of the class, right? So Jamie Merchant, who spoke at what was the neoliberalism opening plenary, he brought this back up. He said that, neoliberalism was useful. It was useful insofar as it helped to consolidate an opposition that then led to this recognition for the need for a kind of mass politics, and the mass politics being for the working class, which for him is not yet constituted, but nonetheless, it's useful. But the problem, which may be sort of a platypus characterization of the millennial left, the problem and the proposition of what the problem was, that insight becomes quickly falsified, the insight that there needs to be a new kind of political force that does not yet exist and cannot yet exist simply by affirming working class as such, or the rhizomatic subject. That task was to build the political party. And I was in those rooms in Brooklyn with people who were around the Jacobin milieu that like did come to that realization. Like they were aware that that was the historical task, but it was a very quick it was an insight that was quickly falsified. We had two conventions, 2013, 2014, I believe, where we invited people from, Joseph Schwartz, the DSA mentor. We invited people from Syriza. We had people from Podemos in our European conference. And it was like, okay, like what is to be done? Right? Like, what would it mean to constitute political power on the left, like anew, like once again? And it burned hot and fast. The questions like burned hot and fast. And then quickly it moved from this neo-Kautskite like turn to dissolving itself into already existing social democratic parties under the guise that what you needed first was to just, better services, goods and services for working people, and that you could use the existing social democratic parties to do that. And so instead of just saying that the millennial left only added up to that, like to reinforce the already existing forces of the diminished capacities of, the falsifiers of the left, the social democratic parties, instead of just saying it was always going to fail, I tried to say, well, look, if we look at these rooms and these conversations in 2012 about the 2007 crises, if you look at these rooms and the conversations that happened between Harvey, Paul Maddock, David Graeber, Paul Newman, all these people that we were able to host in our conversations, there are clearly problems that the left was supposed to take up, that there weren't solutions for, but it never did, right? And so it's kind of stillborn, like the millennial left it knows that it needed to do something, that the historical task was to reconstitute these politics anew. And then it's sort of paralyzed by the detritus of the 20th century, by the existing 157 flavors of revolutionary Marxism, by what we know feels like a gigantic task. And then it settles for advancing the struggle within, the Democratic Party or within, the social democratic parties. And so my presentation was trying to show that there was a potential within the millennial left, but it was falsified by its trajectory.
Right. I do recall that part of your presentation, and I left it out of my summary. And I think there's a reason why I left it out of the summary, and it's not because the way I think of the reason why is because I have a different perspective on that moment, but I'm going to tell you what that perspective is, with the understanding now that the perspective I had at the time was not adequate to the moment either. But this is what I recall. I was involved in a publication called The North Star around the time of the neo-Kautskian moment around Occupy. And at that same time, I was investigating the Marxist Humanist Initiative and kind of aligning with Andrew Kleiman. And I wanted to bring to the North Star just a simple proposition, which is that when it came to understanding what capitalism was, we would understand it in terms of labor time, like in terms that I thought were coming from capital, rather than in Keynesian terms or in some other through some other economic model, which would mean, we're not going to be MMTers. We're not going to try to go for a new deal. We're going to see that these things is closed off just based on the logic of my economistic view. And that was shut down. Not only did people not want to agree to that, but they didn't want to discuss it. And instead, what they wanted to focus on was unity, Marxist unity. And they felt that would be divisive to try to get the labor theory of value as something that was definitive to our understanding of capitalism and therefore our politics. So I didn't see that Kautskian moment as that as actually very different from what it became, which was a way to try to form an organization that would ultimately be ancillary to the Democratic Party. That they were leaving open the door to embrace neo-Keynesian New Deal politics out of opportunism, because so many people who would be interested in the project would be interested in that. So anyway, that was my perspective.
I think that it's important to know that perhaps both tendencies were there, right? Which is why I start with Naomi Klein, because Naomi Klein wants to think about neoliberalism as like the military dictatorship that takes Allende out and puts Pinochet in, and it's like necessary to do that, and that's the force of neoliberalism. And how do you oppose it with real democracy, populist democracy? For her, Hugo Chavez, and that relationship to neoliberalism, to capitalism, leads to a very specific kind of politics, right? So if you think that like the neoliberal order, this new moment within the history of capitalism, is about the military dictatorship against the real democracy, if you turn into an issue of democracy, well, then you land in the problem that I think Jamie Merchant was trying to present in his presentation, is that you think of like the state as a kind of neutral democratic arbiter between interests, and then you affirm, again, this kind of New Deal politics. But it seems like there were conversations because of the austerity crisis, because of the rejection of Obama and the Democratic Party, because of the discontent against a bailout. There seemed to be these inquiries that weren't resolved, weren't actually satisfied by the existing available ideas, which is why I thought that being in those rooms at the time when we hosted those conversations was quite generative, even though I remember being really frustrated in those rooms, in fact. So this is a kind of retrospective, like thinking about what those conversations were about, because I felt like in those rooms, I was like, but what's the solution, right? I was a kind of impatient, like, well, what, like Harvey has these ideas, like what are they pointing to? And what I realized is that they were pointing to a politics that hadn't been constituted. And in that sense, they were pointing beyond the present in a way that we would want, that couldn't just be subsumed back into a new Deal or a new Deal, or now I guess a new Deal, right? And so something else was like attempting to be born, but the only people that could pick up those inquiries in earnest was a new generation of people, because even the theoreticians of capitalism, like Harvey, who had insights that went beyond the present, his own politics, so not his like theoretical insights about capitalism, but his own politics were just a repetition of the New Deal, even though what he was telling us directly in those rooms is that there were new international opportunities to organize the working class that wouldn't be captured by a statist conception of management. So his insights, right, pointed beyond his own politics, and that meant that it required a new generation to turn those insights into kind of political organization and practice. But that was not taken up. So we could say, right, in retrospect, like it was just necessary, like the failure of the millennial left was somehow necessary. But I guess as being like I'm 40 years old, so I'm like of that generation entirely. Like I began like on the left in the anti-war movement, and I've done the whole trajectory. And there was something there, which is why it feels like a betrayal to possibility.
Yeah,
but we're not talking about the panel, Doug.
No, we aren't. Sorry. Go ahead. But we are. We're just talking about your presentation in the panel, aren't we?
Right. I mean, I had a funny role to play, right? Because Platypus members on a panel, what I was trying to do is say, okay, how does the left talk about neoliberalism? How did it do that, like throughout my time as a millennial leftist? And I was putting, Naomi Klein has a version, right? It's the military dictatorship against true democracy. That's her version of it. Harvey's regime of accumulations and motive regulations is another. The emphasis by Andrew Kleiman, right, which I didn't think made it to the final draft, but Kleiman's like insistent that we're still living under the contradictions of use, value, and value, right? And like that needs to be kept in mind. Paul Maddox's like argument that listen, guys, like, yes, these are abstract social relations, but what we're really talking about here at every stage is people making decisions about how to save capitalism from itself, right? Like all of those insights.
All
I
those
was
things need
like,
to be brought together, right? I
right.
thought.
Right, but it's not in a unity sense, right? Like in an
Right.
insight, right? Like
Right,
it's,
right.
the hosting of the conversation in Platypus, it's a constellation. It illuminates an object that is not reducible to each one of these people talking, right? So we're trying to bring about a kind of form of knowledge from the left, a form of education that's not reducible to one talking head presenting their idea about XYZ.
Okay, I'm going to say one thing that's not very platypus, and then I want you to push me on to the next thing. But just that of those points that you raised, Naomi Klein strikes me as kind of just wrong, whereas the other ones strike me as having something to contribute when brought together, maybe not in quite a unity, but that they are all looking at the same object. And Klein just doesn't seem to be to me. So what am I missing there? Or maybe just ignore that observation. But what do you think about that?
Well, Platypus thinks that the left teaches us something, even if negatively, right? So it always has like partial lessons or even negative lessons.
Right.
And the Naomi Klein negative lesson, I mean, there's several things going on, but one of the things that's going on is this replacement of socialism with democracy, right? That what socialism is just like the true democracy of the people also, right? It's like populism, which does creep into the conversation actually that we had in the opening plenary, this kind of like Leclau Mouffe conception of the people. I think that that's there in Klein, and it's part of the history of the left, which means it's part of also the obstacles that we would have to encounter and transform. The second thing is something that came out during the Q&A, which I don't think that you got to, but it was this question about freedom. One of our members, Danny, was asking, right, like, what does neoliberalism have to do with freedom? Like, in what way does it respond to the freedom problem? And I remembered that when we did that book talk with Naomi Klein, one of our members felt really like disappointed that Klein had, or indicative that of a problem when Klein dismissed Friedman and Hayek as being too mired in questions of liberty, right? Because she thought that that was just pure ideology, and that we really just need to work and focus on like what generates goods and resources to support the people. And Ian Morrison at the time, one of the members of Platypus, said, well, doesn't that cede the conversation about freedom to the right, right? So the socialists are going to be like for the goods, for the working people, but these like ideologues, the right-wingers, they're the only ones that are going to get to talk about liberty. And of course, any socialist movement worth its salt in America, out of all places, there's Lincoln there in my background, any socialist movement in America would have to take up the problem of freedom. And so in that way, Klein was deeply conservative, actually, and she showed an obstacle for leftists, right? So we learn from Klein. We learn from Klein not because she's like the best theorist, because we're not examining like theory. We want the left to speak and tell us what's its image of the world and how it's going to change it. So the panels are important insofar as we get leftists to talk about their conception of reality and how they are activating a political force in the world to transform it. And sometimes there's a chasm between the understanding and the what is to be done, like Harvey. Harvey, there's like a real chasm between the two. Also in Leo Panitch. But right, absences and silences and incomplete and negative lessons. That's how we train our students.
Okay. Now I'm very tempted to talk to you about Harvey now, but I'm not going to. I'm going to ask you to move on to the next panelist on your panel, What Was Neoliberalism? And maybe you could tell me why they were selected, who they were, and what perspective you thought they represented in the tripod on the panel.
Okay, so we had 4 panelists.
Right.
We had 3 millennial leftists, and I am the oldest of the 3. So I was there from the beginning of the crimes. And Benjamin Studebaker and Jamie Merchant, who I believe are closer in age, because Benjamin is 33. But all of us, and Benjamin resisted it when we talked about it after in the bar, but I would say all of us were part of the millennial left. And what does that mean? We thought that in that period of time before Bernie and through Bernie, that some kind of politics was possible, some kind of transformative politics was possible. I know that's true because I've heard Benjamin's podcast, I've read the introduction to his book, and we interviewed him on Shit Platypus Says, the podcast that I host for Platypus. And so he's,
Right.
And that way he's part of the millennial left. So there's 3 of us, and then there was a new leftist, Michael Kazin, who was part of the Students for a Democratic Society, and had an account, he's a historian as well, as a historian of American politics. He wrote a book about the new left as well as populism, and is writing a book about Samuel Gompers. And we thought, okay, let's put these people in conversation. I wasn't the organizer for this panel, but this is in terms of how I understand it. The new left goes through a similar trajectory that the millennial left does. They realize that they need to create a new politics in order to realize the horizons of possibility that the old left wanted to achieve, right? So there is a kind of undigested quality to the lessons of the old left and the new, but we recognize the new left as having real political potential, right? So,
Right.
and we wanted him to talk about that, because often what's really popular now is that all that the new left did was just affirm a kind of identitarian interest politics that were immediately subsumable and led to neoliberalism. Right. The interesting thing is that Kazin actually thought that that was true. And so then we had to push back and force him to think, well, in what ways perhaps there was something there that wasn't just about the continuation or the creation of categories that lead to neoliberalism. Jamie Merchant is part of the ILC. I believe, what is that? It's not the International Labor Club.
It's the
I always want to put international, but it's not international. It's something worse
independent.
Than that. Independent. Okay, sure. Independent. The Independent Labor Club, Sean KB's operation. And he also writes about political economy, right? So he said, I'm not an economist. I'm just a guy who writes about political economy. But he sees himself as part of what he conceives of as the constitution of the class, that the moment is now for class constitution, class formation, and that there's a false division among the working class between intellectual laborers and manual laborers. And he sees part of the struggle is to put these 2 divisions of the working class, just 2 divided parts of the working class back together. Right, theory and practice need to be brought back together. He's a vert critique guy, and also inspired by Laclau and Muth. So,
well, wow. See, it's I like the work critique people, and then I hate.
I know you do.
I don't like Laclau very much.
Oh, so. Yeah. Well, they come together in a synthesis in Jamie Merchant and Benjamin Studebaker, who, is someone that it seems to me he's a little embarrassed that he used to be like a Sanders socialist and now has kind of gone post-left on us and is talking about the disintegration of society and the ways in which educational institutions would need to be recovered in order to create kind of better elites, has maybe like slightly Burnhamite conception of what needs to be done. And, but is somebody who I think, he was confronted in the Q&A, like, tell us about why you thought Sanders was a good idea. Like, tell us about why you were attracted to the millennial socialist moment. And he doesn't want to talk about it. He didn't talk about it on the panel. And I get the sense that in a similar way to Dacha, who I heard Dacha's like recent interview with Joshua Citarella, one of the Red Scare girls, who back in the day were like Bernie, right? Like it was like Bernie. And now she's like, I wasn't really on the left. You know, like I wasn't really on the left. It was always about something else for me. And I just think that the millennials of my peers are a little embarrassed that they put a lot of hope in that. But the problem with being just embarrassed is that you start lying about your own history. And actually the children need to know the truth. Like the kids need to know like what that hope was about, because they're liable to repeat the same things that we've done without knowing that they're repeating them.
Very conservative move to do that. I mean, not just because they want to disavow the left, but also just because you reify the failure, I think. You know, like just like, oh yeah, there was never any hope. I was stupid to ever believe that there could be any change in the world.
Right.
And now I'm just adjusting myself to the reality, even though, and failing to recognize that reality has actually changed in that process as well. So yeah, I agree. So that, all right. So you brought Leo in, and what was the other? I'm gonna look at the list
Michael Kazin. So it was Michael Kazin, New Leftist.
I'm sorry, Jamie Merchant, not Leo.
ILC.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So the editor emeritus of Dissent magazine. Should we talk about, or do you want to tell me what Jamie Merchant said a little more, or what did you think of the? I mean, what do you think of the Independent Labor Club's understanding as it represented by Jamie Merchant?
Well, here's the thing, right? So I'll take you as like a student of platypus. Like it's not about like what like one guy said and what one guy didn't, but what wasn't said, it's more interesting. Jamie Merchant came to our panel, bless his heart. Thank you for coming. Interesting comments, and I want to interview him for SPS for our podcast. But what happened was that he gave this theoretical account of neoliberalism. Right? He's like, okay, like I'm going to take the question seriously. Here's my account of neoliberalism, problems of capital mobility, extensions of trade, financialization, et cetera, et cetera. So the story that I think a lot of people on the left will know well. And then says this is falsified in the teens by a different story about neoliberalism, which focuses on state action, for example, someone like Klein, right? And he thinks this is a problem. Ideologically, theoretically, it's a problem. And that really, and this is where it gets kind of interesting, he says that there is no difference between politics and the economy. What the economy is, this sounds familiar probably for you, what the economy, or what the politics are, rather, what politics are just the forms of appearance of the social relations of capital. And that the problem with the left is that it fetishizes these forms of appearance and it tries to act on them, whereas really you have to get to deep structure, questions of value, etc. And so he put his like theory hat on to be on our panel, never mentioned the Independent Labor Club, nor really mentioned what it was trying to do, or had an opportunity to reflect on himself as a leftist as such, except during the Q&A when one of our members pushed him to think about like what is the anti-neoliberalism about? Was it helpful to you? And where did you get your own politics? And in that he said, and I'm gonna like pull this up because I thought that I would read to you like specifically how he formulated this. So he says that neoliberalism was useful as a condensation symbol. So in the populist theory of Laclau-Mouffe, you have this symbol that condenses the antagonism into one image that can be associated to a broader formation, allows different and diverse constituencies to see themselves as reflected back in that proposition. He says another form of this was the 99% versus the 1%, that this symbol of neoliberalism, therefore, was useful insofar as it organized a wide array of interests, of perspectives into a quasi-radical perspective. For close to a decade, this one was really funny to me because both the DSA in our closing plenary and Jamie Merchant in our opening plenary had this conception of 10 years of like radicalization, which I identify with. But then close to a decade, right, this is brewing and stewing, and that's why it was useful then, but it's not useful anymore, right? Something else needs to take its place.
When did they put the beginning of that decade and the end of that decade exactly?
It's unclear to me. I mean, I think that he thinks that the millennial social, he didn't say, but that the millennial socialist moment, the neo-socialism of the millennial left is like the key part of those 10 years. So I don't know if that's the beginning of it, if it's Occupy, since he talked about the 99% versus the 1%. I would venture to say that it probably is, without putting any words in his mouth. Like, that's just my guess, because often what we have found in Platypus is that when we ask millennial leftists about their history, they always periodize it as beginning with Occupy rather than when it really began, which is the anti-war movement, like before, right? Like the post 90s, post Gen X moment. But
I would say that radical moment started in 2008 when the return to Marx happened, at least for me, right? And then ended with the election of Trump, so not quite 10 years, maybe 8 years of critique of capitalism itself. But that's, that would be to ignore how I was a leftist in 91. Like that would be to
Well,
ignore.
you're a Gen Xer. I mean, I think that one of the things that I've been talking to people about because of the panel that you were on was like, oh, Doug has a good sense of himself. You were next to Bill Ayers, and Dave from Theory Underground was calling you the old left, and you kind of grimaced and you were like, I'm not the old left. I'm not the old left. And you pointed to Bill Ayers and you were like, what I am is the tail end of this guy's generation, but is confused by it and is still trying to make sense of it. And I was like, that's right. Like, that's right. Like, Doug has a historical sense of himself as part of a generation that inherits the problems of the new left, which is why you were so angry about it.
Right.
Right. Yeah. But I don't know, the new left, its horizons of possibility, I think, were much higher than the millennial left experience to some degree. But maybe that's what makes us so angry. I mean, I'm not angry. I'm zen about these days.
Sure, you're not. Okay, but I think
I'm angry at the people that are like, still selling socialism. Bill Ayers is not going to sell you socialism. He's going to be like,
you're not angry at Bill Ayers. I understand.
Yeah, Bill Ayers is like, let's go to the protest to oppose Trump, and also maybe do some actions. That was really funny. That was really interesting. Right. Yeah. He's not pretending that he's out there building socialism. Whereas like the DSA in our closing plenary was like, this is, it's just like the New Deal. It's like building socialism.
All right. So, but we can talk in a little bit about my panel because I of course, am very tempted to. But okay, so
that was Jamie Merchant. Jamie Merchant, right, was kind of resistant to think about his practice as a political actor in the world on the left on the panel and kind of put on his theoretician hat, which I think happens sometimes when people are invited to Platypus because they misrecognize us as being like the theorists, which we're not. And that's why I want to follow up with Jamie Merchant, because if anything, I want to learn more. I want to understand more about what he thinks he is doing with the Independent Labor Club. It seems to me, at least from what I can gather from his little interlude into Class Constitution, that there is this division between intellectual labor and manual labor that needs to be overcome, and that the theoreticians, have a role to play in that bridging of that chasm of theory and practice, which is why he didn't like how Benjamin Studebaker was talking about theorists, because Benjamin Studebaker said, well, insofar as we're intellectuals on the left, we need to have an audience so we can advise them. And our role is to advise these people that are going to be doing the stuff. And so Jamie Merchant disagreed with that conception because like, oh, you're like caught up in this like, forms of appearance of like theory and practice. And actually it's about abolishing the chasm between the two. And so they disagreed. Michael Kazin had the best response to Benjamin Studebaker. Michael Kazin was the most politically honest out of the entire panel because he just said, okay, well, I was there during SDS during 68 and they didn't get anything done. They spend most of that convention arguing about the role of progressive labor. And they couldn't really propose anything that led to anything in terms of the transformation of capitalist society. But the Democratic Party did take this up. And so, I'm a socialist that works in the Democratic Party. I believe in the Democratic Party. I think that Michael Harrington had some good ideas. Maybe America can be a little bit more like Sweden. And I think you guys are wrongheaded if you think that you're going to build some kind of third party. This is a two-party system. It's going to be in my lifetime and probably in yours. And so if you're a wayward intellectual looking for an audience, then come join us, because we have an audience. We have an audience of people that are trying to build unions, that are trying to engage in local politics, and they need all the advice that they can get. And so if you're looking for an audience, here it is. It's called the Democratic Party. And I found this to be very clear. Right?
Mhm.
Like he was like, this is who I am, join us. Where it's like, what are we joining if we join Jamie Merchant? The
Independent Labor Club. Yeah.
You tell me about it, Doug. Tell me about it. What do you think?
Look, I haven't been. Okay. All I've gotten, I've interviewed Sean KB. I've gotten a sense from Chris Catrone that it's not a bad project, but and I understand the drive for it in terms of sentiment, right?
Yeah.
And I've heard from members of the Campaign for a Socialist Party what some of the difficulties are with the Independent Labor Club, but I've never attended. I'm not. I would say it's like there are a number of things that are happening kind of adjacent to the Campaign for a Socialist Party, and the Campaign for a Socialist Party is an activist organization filled with good-hearted socialists who want to go out and just do direct work in communities that it's helpful in order to kind of integrate into civil society organizing that's already happening without having a politics yet, without being really political yet. It's a Campaign for a Socialist Party. And it's a very fragile thing, and we're still working it out. Like I'm going to have a meeting with the campaign this weekend, some members of the campaign this weekend, to try to clarify just how to run a Substack where I publish reports from the campaign, along with publishing submissions to another one of these social things. It's a writer's workshop that I've started. Inspired by the campaign, and I'm taking submissions from that and publishing it on the Substack as well. And it's only there, the Substack's there for people who are part of the campaign or people who are part of the writers' workshop to be able to access each other's work and reflections. It's not.
Let me say one thing, because I just want to make sure that like my platypus hat like stays on.
No,
which is like my platypus hat, right? When I ask you like, what's it about? Like what's the ILC about? That's not me denigrating it, putting it down and saying people shouldn't try things. People should try things. It's pretty rotten out there. People should try things. God bless.
I would say the ILC in its inception is about the same thing as the Campaign for a Socialist Party, only from a slightly different direction, and without the aim of helping already existing civil society efforts, but it's a little more oriented towards labor. Right. So, and that means it's trying to talk to somewhat already politicized workers and bringing them together.
It seems like it has the conception of theory as necessary to their project, which I haven't really heard around in the campaign. But again, I just want to emphasize here, just for the children, for the listeners, Platypus is completely agnostic. We are completely agnostic about any political project. Like what makes our project specific is that we want to be the place where the left comes to raise inquiries to itself. What are we doing? What ideas are we grasping? What forms of organization are we using? And to tell us so that we can think through like what's happening, right? And so my slight frustration with Jamie Merchant, who again, I appreciate his contribution, was that he didn't talk about it enough. And that what he ended up doing was taking up the role of a kind of theorist of the economy, as opposed to just taking up his role as like, I'm a leftist. I'm doing this thing in this organization, and here's why it's the thing to do, right? Like speaking to an audience and saying like, this is what needs to be done. And that's always frustrating. platypus panels, we always want to get the best. We want to get the best from each of our speakers, right? And in that way, I thought, again, like Kazan was most politically straightforward and honest. He really just like laid it out there and told us, like, I've got a political project for you if you want to join it.
Right. Yeah. So no. Okay. So like I didn't mean to respond defensively around the campaign, but I guess I did a little bit, and or around the Independent Labor Club, which I see as like I said, an adjacent organization that I want to encourage. But so the difficulty is for all of us. I think that the Sublation, for sure, the Campaign for a Socialist Party, probably the Independent Labor Club, is working through some of our preconceptions without, so like without just trying to simply not think at all. Like there's, like on the one hand, we have these preconceptions like, okay, it's very important for value theory to be introduced to left activists and to workers. That's very important, we think. I know you don't think so, but maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But that's like a preconception that people have, that Jamie might have, right? And I had. And but I was always unsure about taking that to the working class directly, but thought it was important to get people like David Harvey to be true to what their own ideas were, to combat people like Richard Wolff, who was leading people into the Democratic Party with a better understanding of capitalism. So there's that preconception, but when you are no longer trying to form the best version of a party, a pseudo party, without a base, then you don't have to work so hard on perfecting an ideological line, but rather you can be more open about what your thinking is, and being more self-critical. Hopefully, is what I'm aiming at doing at Sublation. So at Sublation, it would be more about having debates around that between like Jamie Merchant and say you or Benjamin Studebaker around just what preconceptions are inadequate or need to be expanded,
yeah, I mean, that would definitely be like me, as in Pamela Nogales, not the platypus member, right? Because in terms of platypus, I'll beat the dead horse because I want to make sure that your listeners understand that in terms of platypus, we don't have any theoretical advice. We don't have any theoretical advice for the left. We don't have any organizational advice for the left. We are agnostic. We're not the source for advice. As an individual, Pamela Nogales, have certain ideas about what the left could become, but that's not me as a platypus member. As a platypus member, I have a job, and that's like a very humble mission to preserve the historical memory of Marxism, because we believe that it could be useful to think about these attempts to transform society towards socialism. And also, it might help our young students, our audience members, those people that might lead movements in the future, that might build organizations, to have a sense of what has been tried, so that they don't end up in this death loop, as Danny called it, of the repetition regression, right? Of trying, right? I mean, I just heard like Ben Burgess speak on one of our panels in the West Coast on neoliberalism. He's like, what we need is a new deal. And I'm like, Jesus, like, it's like Groundhog's Day. And I'm like, can we try to think, So platypus is like, do you want to think the left anew? Let's try to do it. Like, come into our panels, right? Convince our audience, like talk to each other. And which is why the curation of the panel is important, right? Because we do want to pay attention to the proposals that are being put out there, and in how do they rhyme or disagree? What are the things that they choose not to talk about? Like Lenin was on the table, the state was on the table, and I think Jamie Merchant chose not to talk about it. And it raised the question for some of us in platypus, like what would it have been like maybe to have a sectarian on the panel? Like, would they have pushed Jamie to think in a different way? Maybe not, right? So in that way, we try to like create the conversation that doesn't happen on the left, because the left doesn't really force itself to think most of the time.
Right. Well, this is where, as putting on my Sublation hat, not my Doug Lane hat, this is where I start to feel some simpatico with platypus, but also wonder if I can try to be very clear about the difference between sublation and platypus, because I also want to preserve the differences between the different factions and like the history of the efforts that are being made and have been made at Sublation, and encourage writing about that would be reflective on the last 10 years, last 20 years, last 100 years and beyond, and have debates actually, but I want to go beyond symptomology. Not like symptomology is below what I want to be doing, but I want to do something different than tracing the symptoms of the left, and not so much as to develop a perfect ideological line and cast away the wrong think and only have the right think, but it just is it's a different project. And let me tell you a little anecdote and see if this will clarify it for me and maybe for you. While the internal meetings were going on, I was sitting around outside, and because I went in for a little bit and I was told, no, get out. So
you mean at the platypus convention? Okay.
Yeah, at the platypus convention. Yes, while the internal meetings at the platypus convention were going on, I just said, well, can I go to these? And one member said, yeah, I don't see a problem. You're thinking about joining even, aren't you? And I said, sure. And then, but Clint said, no, Doug, we're going to talk about sublation possibly, and you need to not be here for that. So, so I left. And while I was sitting outside, a young platypus member came outside and found me and Clint and like sat down and said, I'm really confused. I don't know what's happening with platypus. I don't know what's happening with the campaign or with Sublation. Is platypus over? Are we supposed to join the campaign now? Is it like, I feel like it's platypus or Doug? And I was like, weird. Okay, totally wrong. And flattering, but totally wrong. And
their heart.
And I was like, listen, what I did in my panel discussion was I just tried to say no to Bill Ayers and clarify why I was saying no to Bill Ayers. And I wasn't doing more than that. And I see platypus as saying no to a lot of things. Now, maybe after talking today, I see that that's not a fair characterization. But platypus raises up these different things that are on offer for us to do again, and is sort of hoping that people will see that repetition isn't going to work and we can say no to it. And it's also, so it's holding an understanding of the past, and so that people can develop something new and not go back down the path of repetition. And that is going to continue to be a vitally important thing to have occur on the left. That is absolutely necessary. There are massive forces working hard to keep us from thinking and redirect us into dead ends and repetitions consciously, and then the unconscious motivations are there too. So that is a vitally important thing.
Yeah, the unconscious forces are strong.
And then so like if someone were to try to, I had a guy actually come up to, it's like part of the writer's workshop. He said, I'm really interested in Marxism too. I don't know that much about it. I said, look, there's a platypus reading group every Monday at the PSU library, and I'm going to be at the coffee social this coming Wednesday. You should go show up for that. Rather than say, well, I said you could also watch Reed Kane's series of lectures on Marxism, which is really worthwhile as well. But if you really want to get rigorous and participate in your education, this reading group is worthwhile. So like, I don't see what Sublation is doing or what the campaign is doing is at all in opposition to the Platypus Affiliated Society. And I see the Platypus Affiliated Society as something that's really useful for a left that wants to move beyond an impasse. So
yeah, I mean, I think it's simple, actually. Yeah. It's not so complicated. Both the campaign and Sublation are interested in positive positive practice, right? So whether that be like supporting theoreticians, people that will argue about political ideas, propositions that they want out there and they want people to say yes to, right? And like the campaign does that as well. They want to build something. Platypus is not creating theoreticians, or if we do, right, we do so sort of by accident because people go down the rabbit hole and they're like, I do want to think about these things. I have something to say also about what David Harvey thinks. I have something different to say. And to that, we say, go and find outlets so that you can make your voice heard, right? Maybe write for Sublation, write for these other publications. But Platypus is not generating the new theoreticians of the left. Platypus's very humble mission is a mission of preservation of what is useless, what has been rendered useless by the left, which is the historical memory, the historical consciousness of Marxism, and its attempts to transform society for socialism, towards socialism. And that is esoteric and strange. And it feels strange. And sometimes it feels frustrating for our students, right, who go and get a platypus education in the reading group, right, like read Rousseau and they read Lenin and they read Marx and they read Luxemburg, and then go out into the world where the leftists are speaking and the leftists themselves have never read any of these things. Or if they have a kind of like very impressionistic idea of like what it is, right? Marx is for against exploitation. Lenin is for self-determination of the people, some version of this. And they feel kind of frustrated because they're like, but didn't you read it? Like, we read it so carefully. Why can't, like, you know, they want to like debate with them. And that is showing us the chasm, the gap between that historical consciousness of Marxism and the dead left today, right? And that does generate frustration. Because that frustration is real. You don't tell the kid, like, put your concerns aside. This is just the way reality is. So Platypus is a place where that young person can go and think through those big problems and that horizon of possibility that socialists, right, were concerned with. So when they go out into the world, right, when they want to try things again, they're not blackmailed by the left into some lowered horizon because the right is so bad and we've got to fight them no matter what. And, you know, and like, anyway, this is the best that we can do. And, or if they do ally and coalition with those people, they at least know that they're doing it out of a temporary opportunism and not because that's the direction of their politics.
Yeah, but wait a minute. I just want to point out, like, everything you said I agree with as something that is worth doing, but not all of that is negative. Not all of what you just said is negative. You have a deeper understanding. You have a deeper understanding of Rousseau than the current left. You have a more accurate interpretation of Lenin and Luxemburg. You held on to a more full understanding of the history of the struggle. All of those things are positives. Those are not simply negative critiques of something. They're not simply negative. They are positive. Those are things that you have as objects of your own understanding. That's all.
Our positive bent is our pedagogy, right? So we have a theory of regression, a philosophy of history. That's what we have to offer students. It's in its uselessness that it's useful to Platypus, though. Right? It's that it can't actually advance a positive practice unless what we're talking about is teaching, which we do seek, and we have a lot of resources, right? So if you want to teach, if you want to learn about, you know, what was Marxism, what are the politics of the Second International, what was the First International, what's the crisis of the bourgeois revolutions, we've spent the last 20 years developing a pedagogical, not just the expertise of the pedagogues, but also the skills to teach people. And we have successfully regenerated new generations of pedagogues. And so that is where we are, as you say, our most positive. It's in our pedagogy. But it has this kind of useless quality, right? Which is why our
but is that dogmatically maintained? Or to put it differently, I know that Adorno championed the uselessness of art as something that was kind of a good in itself when it comes to art, because it creates an openness towards thought to be not to be instrumentalized, in that way? Is it like that, or is it merely a capitulation or an acceptance of the political reality of the moment, where the left is so dead and dysfunctional that you simply cannot apply the learning of the past, the ideas of Luxembourg to this moment, because of the death of the left, which was not simply caused out of some character defect in the left, but also due to historical defeats? And is that the reason why that these things remain useless today?
Right. It's a result of the crisis of Marxism, the failure of the proletarian revolution, the deadness of the left. But that's why the second part of our slogan is also "Long live the left," right? So we think that there's a future for these ideas, that they can become, that they can galvanize, that new generations might find a use for them. And so we preserve them.
I see the campaign, in theory, I'm not saying that this is at all where it's at, but I see the campaign as an effort to build a living left that could make use of Rousseau and Luxembourg and Lenin and Trotsky and Adorno, and hell, I hate to put this in, and maybe you'll hate this, and Guy Debord even. That But sorry, you all right?
That's not in the syllabus. Just to clarify.
I know.
Yeah, that's some Gen X shit. I don't know. Yeah, yeah.
It is. It totally is. But
I'm glad you think that. Look, Doug, like I don't want to like be so tortured about it. I think it's simple. Like as a Platypus member, we're agnostic. Go try things. Right. But this is how I put it to our students and our members. And I said it at our internal conversation. I said, there will be in your lifetime multiple attempts to restart a politics of socialism. Many of those will likely fail, right? But if you want to preserve the historical memory of attempts to transform the world, if you want to preserve Marxist ideas, if you want to preserve the historical consciousness of Marxism, then you'll find some use in our humble project called Platypus. You can be a member of the campaign and be a member of Platypus, but you're going to have to hold some things in tension, because Platypus says these ideas, there's no use for them right now. And the campaign says there's a use for them. And you're going to have to hold that tension. That doesn't mean that you're excluded, right, from thinking in Platypus or from acting in the campaign, but that's up to the person to reconcile. But for our humble project, we're preserving things, because a lot of these things, and I wish you all the best, but a lot of these things will fail. And Platypus will be the place where those defeats can become meaningful. So things are not just forgotten and wasted. And so we have to keep that distinction. We're not the theoreticians of the left. We're not giving advice to the socialists, nor rebuilding the party. We're doing something quite specific. And if you want to take part in that, and if you yourself want to learn how to teach the pedagogy of the history of Marxism, then join us.
Right. And I would just say that the campaign and Sublation are not, Sublation is certainly not saying there is a direct use for these ideas. That is not what Sublation would say. It's not what I would say anyway. And as the head of Sublation, what I would say is there is a way to build a party so that these ideas, tested through the building of a party, will be of some use again.
God bless.
Yeah, but you see that there's a self-reflective component to that it's not merely positive.
Yeah, I mean by positive as in positive practice, as in proposals, right? Like in the propositions, like obviously you're creating it from my outsider perspective. You guys are creating a space for people to try some ideas, to try some like theoretical propositions, put them out into the world. There's a gamble there about an intellectual renewal, which you all think is possible at this present moment. Yeah, I don't have positive and negative are not value judgments, right?
No,
They're
I know.
ways of characterizing the activity. But for our purposes,
they're actually unified. Positive,
right?
and
Potentially,
and
there could be part. Okay. So this is something of a. This is like it haunts us from our very original moment. So Platypus is 19 years old now.
Mm-hmm.
We started the reading group in 2006. We constituted ourselves as an organization at the end of that year in December so that we could put together our first panel, Imperialism. What is it and why should we be against it, in January 2007. So we've been at this for a long time. Mm-hmm. And what haunts us is, okay, maybe Platypus thought at the beginning that there was going to be a division of labor on the left that Platypus would play a part in, right? So we were going to be the place, the kind of clearinghouse of the left can come, reflect, think about what it's doing. And then we were necessary but insufficient, right? We were necessary but insufficient. Then the rest of the left would, maybe a new left could be born, get its act together, do something. New generations of people could try things, maybe even fail, but fail better. And we would be here. What's happened? The sectarian organizations have fallen apart. The millennial left was stillborn. And so there's this question like, okay, what has Platypus done? Right? Like, what is it doing? Jamie Merchant asked it during the Q&A. He's like, what could Platypus have done different in order to galvanize the millennial left, in order to, right? Like, and that's where I get like, no. Like, our humble mission to preserve the historical memory of Marxism and its attempts. We do this because we hope that there is a division of labor that comes about on the left, right? People that take up the difficult but necessary work of organizing working people in the world. People that take up the difficult work of the intellectual labor of trying to understand our society, social relations in the present, and what needs to be done. We hope that those things take place, but they're not going to take place inside of Platypus, right? So we play one particular role in that hopeful vision of a division of labor on the left. And it's not so complicated for me, right? But, our young member, like overwhelmed by all the things that are happening right now, feels like he has to choose, or like which one's over,
right.
Is Platypus over? We graduate in the campaign. No, children. No, it's not. Right. That's not what's happening. You're not graduating from Platypus to join the campaign. You don't have to not be in the campaign to be in Platypus. You can do both things if time permits and you've got the energy for it,
Right. And also, if you feel like you've graduated from Platypus and want to join the campaign, you can. But I wouldn't recommend it for a 19-year-old kid who just starting out. There's
no graduation here. I mean, graduating from our pedagogy means teaching, right? Like if you go through the syllabus, if you've worked through it, then like we have mentorships in place, we have pedagogues calls, we're a disciplined organization. And so that would mean teaching, right? That would mean like appealing to this young person and say, like, you could either be an assistant pedagogue somewhere, or you could take up the role of pedagogy. We have like young people that are also teaching. And again, that's not to exclude any kind of political practice that you might be doing outside of the organization. Yeah.
I just, it seems to me that what happened with Platypus is that, mostly for no fault of its own, the left, as it was, simply rejected Platypus, immunized itself against Platypus in the way it does with a lot of calls to think.
It's funny being around, because now I'm like, I'm like auntie, right? Because I've been around now for a long time. Mm-hmm. It's funny because I actually think that the left does take in what Platypus is saying and then has this sort of cartoonish version of repeating it. When we were first around, I remember people being like, the left is dead. Like, what are you guys talking about? The left is dead. Like, we're here. I'm a leftist. I'm around fighting the good fight. The anti-war movement is alive and well, blah, 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 blah. By the time, like, after Occupy, people were like, the left is dead. The left is dead, and like, you need to rebuild the left. And they have some version, right, of absorbing some of these lessons, but also falsifying them, which also frustrates her members. Second International, radicalism, Kautsky. Oh shit, okay, like, oh, you want to know? You know, Bhaskar Sankara was in a platypus reading group. Like, so these things do get around, but then how people interpret them and what they do with them, it's really out of our control, right? Like, okay, like how do these ideas speak to you? How do you want to put them into use? And sometimes we grow frustrated because what we see around us are people kind of putting our ideas to work in ways in which we think could create more obstacles to realizing socialist politics. And that's difficult, but it shouldn't affect the fact that we're just going to keep doing our work. You know, we can't lose our nerve because the left is quoting platypus at us. I mean, like, now it's gotten to the point where the left is quoting platypus at us, and we're like, uncanny, like, bizarre. People are listening, Doug. There's just a thought taboo, like, around platypus as an organization, so they don't say platypus, but then they'll start talking about things that we've taught them.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, listen, why don't we end this part here? And I want you to, teach me as a platypus member how to understand my own participation in the panel I was on. Would you have time for that?
Yes, I think that we should do that. I mean, for your patron subscribers, but I also want to invite you to come on Shit Platypus Says to talk about your experience at the convention. So I want to give that as a public invitation to you to come and talk to us. But yeah. Let's do it.
Oh, okay, great. I will definitely do that, and we'll figure out a time in between recordings here. If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.